This is a 5-alarm fire in the United States in terms of the access crisis and what that means for people and families and communities in this country. And then, of course, from the vantage point of where I sit, what this means for our overall democracy.
From Interfaith Alliance, this is The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch in New York City.
Now we're seeing threats to IVF, to contraception, to many broader, to gender-affirming care, to much broader forms of reproductive health care too.
We're closing in on the second anniversary of Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health, the earth-shaking Supreme Court decision reversing established reproductive rights nationwide. State after state has taken advantage of this by passing more and more draconian restrictions on the right to reproductive health. But it gets even worse. Oral arguments in a case threatening access to mifepristone, the medical abortion drug, were heard by the court late last month, and there's more to come. This week, I will be joined by Skye Perryman, attorney and president of Democracy Forward. We'll also get a preview of an incredible gathering coming later this month, the Freedom Rising Conference, April 26th to 28th in New York City, from organizer Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis. As we keep growing our library of extraordinary interviews, I want to make sure you are subscribed to the State of Belief podcast. Please visit stateofbelief.com/subscribe. You'll hear this episode in full, as well as recent interviews with Rob Reiner, Dr. Jamar Tisby, Rabbi Sharon Brous, Bishop William Barber, Dr. Anethea Butler, and many more. It would really help us if you would subscribe, rate, and tell people you're close to about all that you're hearing. The State of Belief is made possible in great part by the generous support of our listeners. If you've made a donation, thank you for helping get these conversations heard by more people who need them. If you haven't pitched in yet, information on how to do that is available at stateofbelief.com. And you can find out more about the work of Interfaith Alliance and join us at interfaithalliance.org. And now to my first guest. Skye Perryman is president and CEO of Democracy Forward, which organizes people in diverse communities to value and engage with democracy. The slogan says it all: defending progress, disrupting extremism, building the future. With the recent oral arguments at the Supreme Court on access to mifepristone, the medical abortion drug, further threatening reproductive freedom across the country, and another case that will be heard this week, I am so thankful to have Skye Perryman's expert take on the show this week. Skye, welcome to the State of Belief.
Thank you for having me, Paul. Good to see you.
Really great to see you. Really great to be with you. And I'm just so grateful for you and all that you bring to this moment in our American democracy. And Democracy Forward works on a lot of issues, but one of the things that you have been very, very present to is the fight for reproductive freedom in this country. And it is just under attack everywhere. I mean, we have an 1864 law on the books in Arizona. Arizona wasn't a state. We're in crazy town now, it feels like. So give me your first take on the state of reproductive freedom in America today.
Well, that is such a question, but I'll start by saying what we know and what we've always known. The data has always shown this. Now the reality is matching that even in more prescient ways, which is what we know is that the vast majority of people in this country support the rights of individuals to determine for themselves the course of their reproductive lives, whether and when and how to get pregnant. I'm a person that can get pregnant, whether and when and how to get pregnant, whether to have children, with whom to have children, when to have children, whether not to have children, all of those deeply intimate questions. We know that the vast majority of people in this country, they may have different views about how they would answer it for themselves. They may have different views about how they would wish a family member might answer it or a community member might answer it. But the vast majority of people do not believe that it is the government's role to be engaged in those deeply intimate decisions that people need to make for their lives. That has always been the case.
It's so important to bring that up at the beginning. This is the reality of the people of where the people are right now. So thank you for
And where they are
starting
right
there.
now and where they have been. And since Dobbs, we have seen every time the question of reproductive health care, abortion care has been on the ballot, we have seen voters show up in states that are very different than each other. We're not talking about people necessarily that are in New York City. We're seeing voters in Kansas. We're seeing voters in Ohio. We're seeing voters across the country and people across the country affirming what we've known for a long time, which is that it is antithetical to American democracy, to what our country stands for, to have the government so involved in an intimate decision that can really affect the lives and well-being of yourself, of your community, of your family. So that's like where I want us to start, is where the people are in our democracy. I will also tell you, Paul, and I think you and I have talked about this before, but it's important, I think, for your listeners to know. This has been the case in 2011, well before Dobbs. Extremist Christian nationalists is what we're calling them. Sort of these extremist groups came into Mississippi, tried to run a ballot initiative on personhood. The initiative failed in Mississippi,
Right.
Prior to Dobbs. And so because they could not win this at the ballot box, they had to resort to a legislative bill that was, of course, intended to try to be a vehicle that would go through the courts, that would shape the law in these ways. So we're really dealing with something that is very antithetical to what the majority of people believe, including in very geographically diverse regions and home states like mine in Texas, throughout the country. So that's number one. But then you ask the really hard question: what is the state of it? And the state is devastating. There were already too many restrictions on reproductive health care prior to Dobbs. Prior to Dobbs, depending on what your income level was and where you lived in the country, it could be very hard to access reproductive health care. This was the case before Dobbs, but it is all the more case now. And it is now incredibly devastating, where we're seeing people, families, communities left without care they need, people who want to be moms being left without the care that they need in order to be able to preserve their fertility when they have a pregnancy complication, people who need to terminate a pregnancy for any number of reasons being left without this care. And now we're seeing things, and you've written eloquently about it in Miss Magazine with Reshma, but now we're seeing threats to IVF, to contraception, to gender affirming care, to much broader forms of reproductive health care too. So we're in this is a 5-alarm fire in the United States in terms of the access crisis and what that means for people and families and communities in this country. And then, of course, from the vantage point of where I sit, what this means for our overall democracy. Because what we have right now is the vast majority of people in the country know and believe that these are rights of the people. And we have an extremist movement that is seeking to operate in ways that are not affirming of that belief in that fundamental freedom. And so this is a really, really concerning time. And I'm grateful for you for having this conversation today.
Well, I'm delighted to have this conversation today. My origin story on my commitment to reproductive freedom is from my mother, who is also my origin story for how I became a religious person. She's the one who took us to church. We went to a Presbyterian church in Wisconsin in the 70s. And that was still at a time, the late 60s, early 70s, when, contraception was not available, to folks, and certainly not abortion. And my mother was very just committed to that idea that this is part of religious freedom. It's part of the ability to make decisions about your own life, your own body, between you and God and your family and your physician. And there's just an important point to be made there, because you also are a person of faith. It's not the only thing that dictates why you're doing this work, but it is a true thing. And many people, in fact, the majority of people of faith, also support the freedom of people to make decisions about their own bodies and about their reproductive care. And I think it's just so important to kind of underline that right now, because so many people are using their faith as a reason for restriction, but actually they do not represent religion in America.
Correct. And what we're seeing is a particular brand, a particular sort of very narrow and rigid worldview. And again, if this is your worldview, you can have that worldview. That's something that we affirm in America. But we're seeing an attempt to impose a particular worldview, in many instances, a particularized religious worldview on the rest of us, and associated with Christianity or very kind of fundamentalist or far right Christian nationalism. And not only am I a person of faith, I mean my faith tradition that I grew up in and continue to practice is Christianity, and we know that the vast majority of people that identify as Christians, that identify in other faiths as well, in the interfaith context, all have deep discomfort with the government seeking to impose this type of restriction on people and the ability of them to self-determine for their lives, for their families, for their communities, and for their futures. And so I appreciate that you bring that into this discussion, of course, on stated belief. And it's really important, I think, that people understand. We've seen, even the vast majority of Catholics, and I was not raised Catholic, but our friends over at Catholic for Choice would tell us, and what even those statistics show, that really in this country, people may have any number of conflicting personal beliefs. But most people are aligned that it's really just not the role of government to be involved in these personal, intimate decisions.
100%. Well, maybe you can brief us on where we are with the courts, because really the Supreme Court has already heard one case, I think, and then is about to hear another. And so could you give us a little bit of where we are in the state of play in these very important cases that are really literally life and death in some cases?
Well, I'm really glad you asked that, because one of the things that's happening at the Supreme Court, and we'll talk, but both of these cases, there's a core player representing anti-abortion extremists in the case. And it's this organization, the Alliance for Defending Freedom, which is an organization that by its own proclamation seeks to advocate for a particular religious view and to, and enshrine that view in many instances in our law. And so you see these repeat players and some of the other organizations that you all are familiar with at Interfaith Alliance, but you see these repeat players. And it's why I'm so grateful that, under your leadership at Interfaith Alliance, we've seen Interfaith Alliance weigh in, and a lot of religious communities be weighing in for people in communities and for reproductive health care in these cases. So the two cases that are on the court's docket this term, one has already, oral arguments have been heard and got a lot of attention, which is a case concerning access to medication abortion, or access to an FDA-approved product known as mifepristone. You know that I, as a lawyer and advocate, I represent the generic maker of mifepristone. And so I'll say that to your listeners so they understand the background at which I come at this, at least in this discussion. But that case, with respect to medication abortion, the Alliance for Defending Freedom brought a matter under this plaintiff's name, the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine, which was an organization that was incorporated in Lubbock, Texas, after Dobbs was decided, with the idea that they would sue in order to seek to undermine our FDA, the Food and Drug Administration's, our FDA's authority to both approve and to regulate mifepristone. In the United States, there's one drug regulatory authority. That's the FDA. We don't have 50 of them. We don't have 100 of them. We have one. That's how Congress has set up to make sure that our medications are available and accessible and safe, and that our food supply is available and accessible and safe. About 20 years ago, FDA approved mifepristone for its approved use is for the early termination of pregnancy. It is a medication that's used with another medication that can accomplish early termination of pregnancy for people in a non-invasive context. It's not any type of invasive medical procedure. It's safe and effective. That is what the data has shown throughout the world. That's what the data has shown in the United States. And it has been really a lifeline for many people throughout the country over the past decades. The FDA over time has reduced its own restrictions on mifepristone. And during the pandemic, mifepristone began to be distributed via telehealth so that people could access it. And the safety and efficacy data there was exceptional in showing that there was no safety concern about the distribution of mifepristone via telehealth, which of course the medical and scientific community had said for some time, and data in Europe and other places had confirmed. And so FDA in 2021 relaxed a restriction on mifepristone so that it could be available to people via telehealth. This is really important for people in small towns. It's important for people in rural areas, and of course, under the care of a medical professional that would determine if this was a course of action for someone. So not just available. And this is something that's being challenged in the case. And so these extremist groups not only tried to challenge the overall approval and to try to seek to have mifepristone taken off the market altogether, which was something that the Supreme Court already stayed last year, but then now are seeking to have the medication go back to being regulated the way it was in much earlier times when it was not near as available for people. So this is a really, really concerning. It's concerning. Doctors are very concerned about it. Healthcare professionals, patients, community advocates, and then religious organizations and religious leaders also, because it's just another way to try to restrict the access that continues to exist in the country. It's also a real attack on science and evidence and data and sort of expertise. And that's very concerning as well.
Right.
So that's the mifepristone case. And the oral arguments were heard. I think you and I may have talked about this, but it's important for your listeners to hear. During the oral arguments, there was reference to a Victorian era law known as the Comstock Act, which these extremists are seeking to try to impose. This was a law that was passed before women had the right to vote, and certainly one that has been really broadly abrogated, but yet they're trying to resuscitate it. And even going back to sort of Victorian era laws that ban sort of obscene types of materials to try to restrict access. So that's a very unfortunate and very concerning thing to be contending with in 2024, especially when our country is already in this healthcare crisis. So that's one. The oral arguments were heard. The court will issue its decision later this year, and I'm happy to come back and talk to you about that.
Do you have any inkling about where it's going to go? I mean, you listened to the arguments. So you must have a sense of, from the questions that were asked. Do you have a sense of where the court is going to come back?
As a practice, I don't do crystal ball reading, but I'll tell you what we did hear in the arguments was a lot of questioning around really why this case is even in the courts to begin with, because the plaintiffs in the case, the group that initiated the case, these are not doctors that prescribe mifepristone. These are not people that have been harmed by any type of issue with the medication. And so there really is a concern, of course, about even how this case got as far as it did and whether the plaintiffs have standing in the case. And so you did hear a lot of questioning that way. And then, of course, there was really concerning questioning that you heard from some justices, the same justices that were behind Dobbs, that really do seem to be taking these really dated arguments from the Victorian era, trying to impose a real theocratic type of law on people. They didn't necessarily say what their views were, but the fact that there was attention on that by at least two of the justices is really concerning, even if those justices don't have the majority this time.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I mean, it is, the anti-science piece seems very real. And also like the kind of, I feel like it reminds me of, I think, Creative, where there wasn't really an actual plaintiff, but it's in theory, things are in theory. And so, but I don't, I'm not a lawyer, although I play one sometimes because I have a lot of lawyers in my family. But, I mean, it feels like if you're not talking about a real case, it's the theory, like that's squishy. And so I don't know. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, the main takeaway is that there is a far extremist movement, a very far kind of right, rigid, narrow extremist movement that has been working for years to shape the law through our courts. And that will go so far as to seek to resuscitate theocratic Victorian era laws that will seek to make up parties or sort of make up theories to try to bring cases into the court. And so that's really the broader trend that we see, the same, that we see with 303 Creative that you're referencing for your listeners, and that we see with this case in Texas that is now at the Supreme Court. But this coming week, the court will hear oral arguments in another case that is equally and incredibly concerning and frankly very concerning for people like those that listen to this podcast, that I think are really I'm interested in the well-being of people and families and communities, which is a case involving emergency care. And so I'd love to talk to you a bit about that case. You'll remember, Paul, that sort of, in earlier times of our history, people that were in an emergent situation might make it to the emergency room and they would be turned away or dumped from their health care, either because they couldn't pay or because someone wanted to discriminate against them or because there wasn't capacity. And so in the 1980s, Congress passed a law called EMTALA, the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, that mandates that emergency facilities that take federal funds cannot turn away patients at the emergency room door. That if you're in an emergent condition in this country, in the United States, there has to be an effort taken to stabilize you and your condition. That law was signed by a Republican president. It's been a bipartisan supported, non-controversial law for many years. After Dobbs, when states started enforcing broad abortion bans or passing broad abortion bans, states like Idaho, some of those bans are such that they conflict with EMTALA because they prevent the ability of healthcare professionals to provide abortion care, even in these highly emergent situations where that is the type of care that is needed to stabilize a patient. So you're talking about someone that presents to the emergency room, often bleeding in an emergent situation where their life, their health, their fertility, future fertility could be at risk, right? And that one of what doctors will tell you, we represent the national medical groups in the case. So we represent the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and the American Medical Association and the American College of Emergency Physicians, among many other physician groups and healthcare professionals in the case. What they'll tell you is that there are times where really the treatment that is necessary and the treatment that the person needs and asks for is something that would amount to an abortion or a termination of pregnancy. And so to the extent that the abortion bans are so broad that they would restrict care in that circumstance, they conflict. Those state laws conflict with federal law. And under our Constitution, spelled out in our Constitution, is our supremacy clause, which says that we are one country and that when federal law conflicts with state law, it is the state law that has to give way. And so the Department of Justice in this case brought a case in Idaho after it was clear that the Idaho law was conflicting with this mandate under EMTALA. And the district court found that the Idaho law was unconstitutional to the extent that it prevented this emergency room care. But unfortunately, now this case is at the Supreme Court in Idaho, which is again represented by the Alliance for Defending Freedom and others of these aligned groups that we see in a lot of the Christian nationalist kind of contexts, are seeking to prevent federal enforcement of EMTALA and the ability of people to access medical care, even in these very, very by definition emergent and life-threatening situations, and health-threatening situations. And so that's what the court will hear this coming week. And I think it's a really important case. Again, we represent the nation's medical community has weighed in, saying that this would be devastating if laws like Idaho were able to, if states like Idaho were able to continue to restrict this access. Individual healthcare professionals have told their stories of the types of care and patients they've seen. Patients have told their stories about how they've been turned away. And so this is a very concerning situation. And of course, the court will hear arguments next week. So we'll have to see how that goes.
It is shocking to hear how these kind of laws, which are they purport to be pro-life, they purport to be pro-women and pro-people, and yet they end up injuring women and injuring people, and it is just like it's so destructive. And I think of that, the very famous Katie Cox case, where she was, couldn't get health care, and it was threatening her ability actually to have children in the future. And so like, this is not, people should be able to do whatever they want, honestly. Like, this is a very personal decision, but a lot of the rhetoric that is surrounding it is just laid bare to be false. I think often it's just about control.
It's really, I mean, so in the Kate Cox case, we represented in the Texas Supreme Court in that case the doctors there who also were sounding the alarm, who were sounding the alarm bell. But I was on a call just yesterday with another woman who has been trying to have, she and her husband have been trying to have kids for many years, and she was turned away from care in Florida as a result of this type of extremism. And so, I mean, this is happening all over the country. It is a dire situation. And I do think, and I think maybe because we're on state of belief, it's important to focus on this. I do think that your point about the rhetoric is really an important one to emphasize here, because these are cases that I just don't, you know, in all of these cases, really, you can't see how people that actually would care about people and communities and families would seek to restrict access to what we know is essential health care, and what all the medical groups will tell you is essential, and in many cases, life and health saving care. But in this case, particularly with EMTALA kind of in the forefront, I mean, you're literally talking about turning away people who are in need of emergent care and
Hmm.
seeking to turn those, you know, seeking to have a law that prevents medical facilities from being able to comply with federal law, from being able to comply with bedrock principles of medical ethics, to do no harm, and to put the patient's interests first. I mean, that is really one of the things that's at stake here. And so it's really, we're definitely going to be paying attention. I'll be at the court on Wednesday, of course, on behalf of our clients, but it's really concerning.
Yeah. What do you think is like, the thing that people in their communities can do and should do right now? I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on was just like we need knowledge. We need like really clear knowledge about what's at stake, and what's being attempted through our courts, because clearly the people don't want this in other ways, but through our courts. What do you think are ways that our listeners can, be active in this, and have a next step in their in how to show up around issues of reproductive freedom?
So I think I'll list it. I think there's a lot that can be done. So that's hopeful maybe in this time. So one is, these are attacks on our democracy, plain and simple. They're attacks on everything about the way of our life in America, about the ability to hold our freedoms, about the ability to raise our families, about the ability to be in communities with people. And so I think we need to see that for what it is. And one thing that people can do is just to make sure that they are engaged in their local communities, that they are registered to vote, that they are encouraging people to vote, even if these things are not. There's a lot of states that are trying to keep these questions off their ballots, but I do think just being informed, understanding, and making sure that you're showing up in the ways that you can, in the ways that our society provides through voter registration is very important. And that's not like a side, oh yeah, everybody says that. That is like super important. But more important, but also, along with that, many of your listeners I know come from faith communities, or people of faith, or people of some type of moral belief or code. It is very important that we show up with our full selves to these situations. I've been doing this work a long time. I was the general counsel of the American College of OBGYNs. I've represented healthcare providers. I've represented patients. I've represented religious leaders. And it's important that we show up with our full selves and that we tell our stories, because everyone that we know has a story about care that they needed, about maybe a complicated pregnancy, or a time that they did not want to be pregnant, or a time that their family member was seeking to maybe build a family through IVF. Everyone has these diverse stories, and they arise in personal context, and they arise within the context of your religious traditions, or your moral traditions, or your beliefs. And it's important that we be able to tell these stories and to talk about these issues, to share. You've shared vulnerably. I mean, to share about some circumstances, either with ourselves or with our community members, in order to help people understand that, like, we're not alone, that there are a variety of people in this country, the majority of people in this country understand that these are issues of real deep personal meaning. So I think showing up and talking about this with your full self, if you are a
Yeah.
person of faith, how does this track with your faith? If it's not contrary,
Yeah.
to your faith beliefs.
Yeah.
Or maybe even if it is, you don't believe that the government should be, you don't believe that the government should be dictating your particular perspective for everyone else in the country, because that's not the kind of country we live in. So that's also really important. I would say that misinformation is a huge threat at this moment, not only to healthcare and healthcare provision, but also to our democracy as a whole. And so what you have said, being informed, like you said, we're seeking information. I think your podcast does a great job of that, but there are, you can definitely look to go to reputable websites, whether that is the American College of OBGYNs, whether that is the Guttmacher Institute, whether that is sort of media outlets that actually source their materials from medical information. There's a lot of efforts to confuse. And many of these groups that are out there seeking to restrict reproductive health care, they seek to appear like medical organizations. They seek to appear like the experts. And so I would say go to the source, the Supreme Court. You can go to the Supreme Court and pull the docket up, and you can see all the briefs that have been filed on both sides of these cases. You can see for yourself who's showing up. And I think that's really important to sort of make sure that we're well informed. And we're always happy at Democracy Forward to be a source of reliable information. People can go to our website, democracyforward.org. They can sign up, and they can also email us even. And people say we actually check they can email us if they are in search of some type of information. And so I think those are some things that we're wanting people to do. And I will say, I always try to use these platforms to just make sure people know what abortion funds are. But these are organizations that pay for and are able to help make healthcare more accessible for people that are not able to access it in their home communities and that do not have the financial well-being to be able to travel on a minute's notice to obtain care. And so continuing to support abortion funds is really important. There's likely one in your state if you're listening, the National Network of Abortion Funds, but I always try to use these platforms to make sure people are aware of what they are, go research it, and that could be a good place to also be sure that you're supporting.
Yeah, thank you so much, Skye. The last question, which we ask of everyone, is what is giving you hope in this time when so much is going on? But what gives you hope right now?
Well, I have hope in the people and the communities that we work on behalf of every day. I see every day people putting themselves on the line, not just in the reproductive healthcare context. We work with parents and teachers who are facing book banning and censorship and extremism in that way, by the way, by some of the same groups that are seeking to ban healthcare. We work with immigrant communities. We work with individuals who are doing a hard day's work and not being paid fairly for it. But everyone in this moment seems to understand the stakes and is rising up and is really looking to use their lives in ways that that can propel us forward. So that gives me hope. And then also looking back at history gives me hope, because we are in we are at an inflection point. It is, I do think, an existential moment for many of the ideas behind American democracy about whether we're going to move forward or whether we're going back. And you literally have people trying to take us back to the 1800s. I mean, actually, it's not even metaphorically. This is like actually happening in oral arguments recorded at the Supreme Court. I mean, these are the conversations we're having today. But if you look through history, you do know that that it has taken a lot of work and dedication, and it's been very scary many times, like we are here now, but that people do have a way of being able to pull forward. But we've got to get very serious and we've got to be motivated. So I have hope, but it's realistic hope. And it's hope that depends on it depends on everyone in this moment doing what they can do for themselves and their communities and our democracy as a whole.
Skye Perryman is president and CEO of Democracy Forward, an attorney, activist, and organizer. She is also a very, very, very valued member of the Interfaith Alliance board. I am so happy about that. And a personal friend and just a beloved person in my life. So Skye, thank you so much for making time to be with us on this State of Belief. We appreciate you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Up next, Freedom Rising. Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis will have the details of this incredible conference, April 26th through 28th in New York City. You can hear full episodes of The State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. You'll also find links to topics we discussed this week, as well as transcripts and more. And make sure you subscribe at stateofbelief.com/subscribe. You're listening to The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet. Welcome back to The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President, Reverend Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch. The Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis is the longtime senior pastor at Middle Church in New York City. Author of the excellent book, Fierce Love, Jackie is an activist, preacher, speaker, writer, and teacher. She also hosts the Love Period podcast. On April 26th to 28th, the Freedom Rising Conference is bringing an amazing group of leaders, organizers, educators together at Marble Collegiate Church. Our Senior Director of Field and Organizing, Maureen O'Leary, will be presenting, and the whole Interfaith Alliance team will be there, and we want you to be there with us. And so, Jackie, it's so great to have you here on The State of Belief, and tell us about Freedom Rising. Boy, do we need some Freedom Rising.
We need it now, Paul, don't we? Right today. Absolutely. Thank you so much for your enthusiastic welcome. And it was good to bump into you in New York the other day. It was great.
Oh, yeah. I mean, no coincidences. This was meant to be. So this is not the first time you've held this. This is an ongoing series that brings together, really, I mean, some of the most inspiring, beautiful people who I've ever had the privilege to work alongside. Tell us what feels special about Freedom Rising this year.
This is our 18th conference, Paul, and
wow.
we got, I can't believe it, right?
Yeah.
And this might be the hottest mess time in which we've offered this conference. We certainly, in the 2016 election, really focused on saving our democracy. There's a lot of bad news to share. We know the world's on fire. And I think there's some fake good news out there that maybe somebody named Donald Trump might be a messiah or a savior. But the actual good news is that God is love. God is love and wants the healing of all the people and this planet. And in November, love is going to win because we, the interfaith, multi-faith movement for love and justice, are organizing, Paul, because we understand everything that's at stake right now.
So tell us, I love the format of this conference is like each day offers a theme. And so it's like, it has a momentum that is meant to propel us out into the world. Tell us about the different days' themes.
Yeah, that's right. The first day is a day to gather to say, if we're going to be the change, then we need to be well. So we're hearing from people like Cole Arthur Riley and Melba Marquez Green and Gabby Bernstein, people across disciplines, across religion and across a political perspective, but all understanding that our democracy needs to be saved. And in order to do that, we need to be well. So that's day one.
Like as individuals, like that it matters how we treat ourselves, how we care for ourselves. That's right. So it's actually an opportunity to not always be like, okay, that out there, but actually look interior and say, is it well with my soul? And how can I be a blessing because I've blessed myself in a way?
Correct. Like we're going to be talking about neighbor love. We're all inextricably connected. But you can't love your neighbor if you don't love yourself. So this is loading in on me as an activist, artist, preacher, prophet, mother, dad, uncle, person in the world. I've got to be okay if I'm going to do this really mission critical work.
Right.
And on the second day, it's our move day. So we've got all kinds of movement builders, from people like Robert P. Jones, who will do an analysis of race in America, to Latasha Brown, who's going to help us to remember how important voting is. And we're also looking at issues, Paul, like what about gun violence? And what about reproductive justice? And what about Mother Earth? And what about our trans and queer siblings? And what about anti-racist work? What about building a world that's not anti-Semitic or xenophobic or racist? Those are the kinds of issues we'll discuss on Saturday. And then when we get to Sunday, it's the world. And this is a place of wild inspiration. You've been to church at Middle, so you know our worship is off the chain.
And so good. So good. Yeah.
And what I love about this Sunday is because our colleagues at Marble Church are hosting us. It's sort of like, guess who's coming to church? There are some people who talk about their membership in Marble Church, but we're taking fierce love and radical worship to our wonderful friends at Marble. And then a day of really full-on inspiration from Kelly Brown Douglas and William Barber, and a panel of artists who are saying that art actually creates the world about which we dream. So that's going to be hot.
Wow.
In the middle of the space is a beautiful art day at our friend's art house in Brooklyn, where we're going to be hearing music and looking at visual art that was created by incarcerated individuals to talk about freedom.
Wow. This sounds so great. Now, before we go any further, how can people get involved? Because some of our listeners are in the, nearby, or maybe could hop a bus or a train. Others folks are around the country. I would encourage anyone, if you can catch a plane, do it. But what is the best way for someone to participate who may not live nearby?
We are so delighted that the conference is fully digital this year. So if you can get a bus, train, plane to come to New York, we still have tickets available, and Marble's got a great big space for us. But also our conference is fully digital, put together with our friends at Candler Foundry. So go to freedomrisingconference.com and find yourself a physical ticket or find yourself a digital ticket, which gives you access to all of these 3 days of beautiful workshops and convenings and keynotes.
Yeah, I think sometimes, we think, that's those people who are doing it. It's like, I'm not enough to take part in a conference like this, because they hear the names you're talking about, and those are like, they're so wise, they've so accomplished. But you and I know that all of us need sustenance, and there's no one there who's coming in with all the answers. And even the people, all of our listeners, you have something to say. You have something to add to a conference like this. Like, it's not just about the people in front. It's about the collective. And so it's never. So I just think that's a really important lesson for all of us. Like, you and I, we're preachers. You can hear us right now. We're like, yeah, let's talk and let's sing and let's dance. But just as important as the person who we relate with, who's listening, and then might do something absolutely amazing in their personal life. And everyone has a role to play. And I think it's so important with these kind of conferences not to think about stars and people and constellations around the stars, but that everyone is a light and everyone has something to offer.
I think that's the most important thing, Paul. You and I are part of this multi-faith movement for justice. And yes, that includes folks like Valerie Kaur and William Barber, but it also includes folks like you who know that love needs to be on the ballot. Dr. King famously said, the only thing that can make the hatred recede, or the light, is light. The only thing that can make violence recede is love. So this is a love-driven movement with people across disciplines, across generations, across faith. And you, my friends who are listening, you are one of the ones we've been waiting for. Whether our political party is Democrat or Republican or Independent, we know that our democracy is eroding. And if we want to stop the failure of democracy and the destruction of Mother Earth, We remember that God is for the healing of all the people and for the protection of the planet. And we are co-creators with God. We are co-stewards with God.
Yeah.
We have a responsibility to load in at this time so that love can win in November. And that's what we're organizing for, Paul.
Yeah, and I'm so delighted that Interfaith Alliance is taking part, and there's really practical things that we are sharing with our community about showing up at the polls, becoming a poll chaplain, protecting poll workers, protecting your democracy in your local setting, and speaking up for issues that we care about, and not letting other people frame an issue, but rather really helping the broader public understand that we all benefit when LGBTQ people have respect. We all benefit when people have the right to make decisions about their own health care and their own life. And and we all benefit when our democracy is functioning well. And so I think it's just really, it's wonderful. We don't have a lot more time, but I did want to ask you a personal question around in this time when so much is being asked of you, Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis, and that many of us feel, depleted, and just hard pressed. I'm just wondering if you might share with our listeners just something that you do to bring yourself back to yourself in a way, and that none of us are perfect at this, and I'm not setting you up as the guru who has all the solutions, but I do know that this is something you care about, and I would love to hear any suggestions or encouragement that you might offer our listeners for how to do that thing about not losing ourselves to despair or hopelessness. But
that's such a good question, Paul. Thank you for asking it. There is a sense some of us are wired to run into the fire when things are hot. And I am such a person as that. That's why I convened this conference. It's a time of emergency and we've got work to do. But also, I think we serve this God who values each of us and knows us by name. And I think my job as a child of God is to take care of this vessel. So what I do is I find the silly every day, including at staff meetings and at home. I find laughter to be a cure. I would say laughter, deep, loving relationships with not just romantic love, but our friendships, our partners in life, our kiddos. Laughter, love, and I'll unalliterate and say, and speaking the truth. Part of the reason we're unwell sometimes, Paul, is because there's a kind of calcification of dishonesty, not being transparent, holding on to resentments that kind of get in our psyche, almost like plaque gets in our blood. So I think if we keep it honest, meaning floss our spiritual teeth every day, tell the truth to God, to your partner, to your kiddos, to your friends, be honest, love hard, love the people you love hard, and that includes yourself, and laugh often. That's my tripart way to stay whole in the world.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the last thing that I'll ask you is something we ask everybody who comes on the show is, and maybe you've just answered it, but I want to offer you a different way in, which is, where do you find hope right now?
Oh, that's a different question. Even though this is a time of emergency, even though our democracy is at threat, even though the politics are toxic, all over this nation are what our friend Brian Blunt calls pocket of resistance. People are gathering together. There are protests today. People are sitting at their kitchen table organizing. Folks are writing postcards to encourage other folks to vote. They're talking about making repair. They're making beautiful art. There's a kind of, in the zeitgeist, there's a we can, is what I'm sensing. We can rise up together in love against fascism. We can rise up together in love against the erosion of our human rights and the destruction of our nation, of the soil. And it's people doing what they feel most passionate about, right, Paul? It's my heart is cracked wide open around voting rights. I'm here. I'm so concerned about the environment. I'm here. I'm concerned about trans rights. I'm here. I'm making a podcast over here about reproductive justice. There's a kind of coalition of people organizing around the spaces where they're brokenhearted. It gives me hope that this movement, this interfaith movement for love and justice, has many leaders, including the people who are listening to us, who might make their way to this conference in New York. They know what time it is, and they're doing a little bit of something about it everywhere they are.
The Freedom Rising Conference is April 26th to 28th at Marble Collegiate Church in New York City. The list of leaders featured at this event includes so many names that inspire and create genuine change. All the information is online at freedomrisingconference.com. I'm going to say that one more time, freedomrisingconference.com. And as the Reverend Dr. Jackie has assured us, you can come in digitally and
That's
you
right.
will also benefit in such a big way. Reverend Dr. Jackie, it is
Thank
so
you.
great to be with you. So great to be with you. Thank you for bringing this amazing conference to the world, and thank you for joining us on this State of Belief.
Thank you so much, Paul, and I'm glad Interfaith Alliance is going to be there. I'm delighted to be with you today. Thank you so much. Come through, y'all. Come on, let's do this.
Please be sure to subscribe to The State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform, or at stateofbelief.com/subscribe. We need your help to keep making The State of Belief. Become a partner in this crucial work with a financial contribution today. Information on how to donate is available at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. And share what you're getting out of this show with the people in your networks. Let's get more people listening and keep these conversations going on Facebook and Instagram at State of Belief. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. The State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch on The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.